Angry Moderate, driving south on I-89. It's Saturday, August 18th. Driving safely, concentrating on the road, not concentrating on the camera, watching, looking in my mirrors, you know. But on my way from New Hampshire down to Dracut, Massachusetts, to teach a soccer coaching course to a bunch of incipient master coaches. By the way, everybody in Massachusetts talks like that. Everybody. Dracut. Right? There's nobody who says, oh yes, I live in Dracut, Massachusetts. That's all, oh yeah, I live in Dracut. Which is one of the reasons I moved out of Massachusetts many, many moons ago, because I felt myself drifting in that direction, you know. I would go to the coffee store and I'd be like, yes, I'd like to have a... How did that happen? Could I please have a dark roast and could you fill it up to the top? Oh! Right, so, anyway, needed to get to another part of the country so that that didn't happen to me. Anyway, you'll see that the Angry Moderate fades, you know, sometimes I'm bright and in the light, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up, and then sometimes we fade a little bit into the shadows and just, you know, roll with it, because I feel today like it's important to record this show. I have this time as I'm driving down south to Dracut, Massachusetts, and I feel like this is a very important time as we are moving into the sort of the last months of the election season, so that I can talk about money, which is obviously what the Angry Moderate, me, talks about all the time. And what's really important is to be able to understand and to differentiate in all of the conversations that are going on, the political conversations, to be able to differentiate between politics, values, and all of those things, and money, because they are really unique topics. They are not conjoined. They're not topics where when people make arguments about money, political or value-based arguments, they're not necessarily based in the realities, the financial realities, the economic realities that you need to understand in order to make informed economic decisions. So, here we go. A lot of people on the political right have a certain value system. It's not a bad value system. I'm not going to, you know, again, I'm angry moderate, not angry leftist and not angry right-wing person. The value system that a lot of people on the right espouse is a value system in which they see debt and borrowing as sort of anathema to good living, to righteous living. They see, you know, I'm reading a book right now called Things Fall Apart. And in the very beginning of the book, the first, you know, 10 or 20 pages, there's a description of a man in a village who is careless with money and doesn't work very hard. And there's a lot of anger directed toward him, seemingly by the author, which is interesting to me, but also by his son in the story. Anyway, we are a society of values. We are human beings who base a lot of our decisions upon our value systems. And a lot of people, a lot of conservatives, have a value system in which they find debt and borrowing and sort of the idea of freeness, you know, the idea of not having to work hard for one's whatever, etc., as being very disturbing to them. And so a lot of people on the political right, a lot of conservatives, when they look at government spending, when they look at private spending, when they look at debt, when they look at credit card debt, etc., they see something that to them violates or goes against their values. And then that extends into their political arguments. And so what you oftentimes hear, and again, this is left and right, but I'm just, you know, talking a little bit about the political right here. What you'll often hear in political debates is people will say, the most important issues are the economy and la la la. And people on the political right oftentimes will look at, you know, values arguments, whether it be, you know, family values. There are people on the political right, for example, who don't believe in same-sex marriage, or there are people on the political right, for example, who are anti-abortion. So they see those as values issues, or, you know, moral issues, or whatever. Those are, you know, those are not, in their mind, economic issues, or, you know, about the economy. So then there's a differentiation. And then people on the right will say, but aside from those issues, those kind of values-based issues, then separate from that are economic issues. And then they'll start saying, and the country can't afford to continue to deficit spend, and we can't keep going into debt, and the multi-trillions of dollars of debt are going to destroy the nation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, here's the thing, really important to understand. You like that? Wow, I'm still driving, right? Very few cars on the highway paying attention, no deer, no other quadrupeds dancing across the highway in front of me. Wearing my seatbelt, good, angry, moderate, responsible guy. So here's the thing to understand, that those arguments that the political right is saying are economic arguments are not. They are values-based arguments. The argument that the government can no longer afford to deficit spend. The argument that public debt is going to destroy the country. The argument that we are going to have to, we're going to pass all of this debt down to our children and their children, and they're going to have to make up and pay it all back in taxes. That's not true. That is an untruth based upon simple understanding of what modern money is in a fiat currency system, in a system in which currency, we don't have a gold standard. Our money is not tied to some commodity. These arguments are not true, and this is what's so unbelievably important to understand. I cannot tell you how incredibly important this is to understand. That was like my kind of hippie-yuppie thing all at once. If you understand anything in this election season, if you embrace any understanding in this election season, is understand that if you are voting based upon, for Romney and Paul Ryan, based upon the argument that we need to stop deficit spending and we need to stop, raising the public debt, et cetera, you are making a false identification. It may be a values-based identification. You may be saying, and you don't know this or you're not willing to admit it, you may be saying, I just find debt and deficit spending to be against what I believe in terms of my values. That's fine. And that's honest and that's true. That's not false. But arguing that the country is going to heck in a handbasket, where does that metaphor come from anyway? Or that hell in a handbasket? Like, what's the handbasket part? I don't get it. Arguing that we need to cut the deficits and reduce public debt because if we don't, somehow it's going to be destructive to the nation, is false. That's false. As a matter of fact, in pure accounting terms, every dollar of deficit that we create is money spent on things that we might need. If the government says we're going to spend $500 billion and give $5 billion to each of the states to, upgrade their infrastructure and to hire a bunch of workers to upgrade their infrastructure, and that's going to be public debt. All of that money is being used, that public debt is being used for arguably productive means to create employment. Now, a lot of people on the right would say we shouldn't have government-sponsored employment, we should have private, and again, I think that to a great extent that's a values-based argument rather than an economic argument. Now, this is, again, if you understand anything in this election season, if you embrace any, if you go out there into the world to read and research and understand as November, as the election approaches, this is the quintessential issue. Like this will separate you and your ability to vote for a candidate based upon really what's best for the economy, as opposed to who you like, who you don't like, who you like stylistically, who you don't like stylistically, what your values are. Most people on the left who vote for Barack Obama, they have a certain value system. Most people on the right have a different value system. Does that mean that either is wrong or right? No. When people on the right, I was listening to the Dan Pierce show. He's an AM radio disc jockey here in, this part of New Hampshire. By the way, you listen to his show, it's like a 3-hour show, and an hour and 45 minutes is commercials. This is the Dan Pierce show, and We'll be back in 30 minutes after 30 minutes of commercials. And he comes back and he's like, I'm going to talk about money, but first, let's hear from our sponsors. It's like, wow, no wonder people listen to NPR. At least you get a little bit of, stuff as opposed to, Waltham camera and stereo, all those commercials. So Dan Pierce was making this argument the other day that was completely and utterly false. His argument was, and it's an argument that's articulated by people like Karl Denninger. By the way, I referred to him the other day as Rick Denninger because I was thinking of Rick Derringer. Do you remember Rick Derringer? Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo? When I saw my first big rock concert when I was in 9th grade, was Aerosmith at the old Boston Garden. See, drink it, Boston Garden. At the old Boston Garden. And this was back when I was in 8th or 9th grade. We rode the subway into Boston, and then, all these, people who were very scary, and I was kind of like, ooh, this is very scary. I'm going to pretend not to be scared and be kind of, oh yeah, I'm cool. And I was like, 4 feet, 10 inches tall. Oh yeah, I'm cool. So Rick Derringer warmed up for Aerosmith. It was awesome. Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo. We were psyched. And then Aerosmith, this was like after, I think, the Get Your Wings album. And it was, it was really early on in the whole Aerosmith thing. So it's pretty cool. Anyway, Karl Denninger is a blogger. He has this thing called marketticker.org. He's a belligerent and very bellicose fellow. He's like a quintessential. That's the second time I've said that in this show. I get caught on words and I, repeat them over and over again. He's a libertarian, and so he kind of is willing to bash the right and the left, but he's very conservative also. Anyway, his argument is a very conservative economic argument. It's all like, he's like, oh, it's all the math, people. You can't cheat the math. And he goes on and he shows all these graphic representations of how government spending is the only reason that we've had any kind of an economic recovery in the last, 4 years is based upon government spending, which is true. It's not like we are all of a sudden this great productive country, right? It's not like we're producing all kinds of stuff. It is about government spending. It's about the actions of the Federal Reserve. It's about quantitative easing. It's about liquidity being pumped into the system. And then that is, to a great extent, why we have experienced somewhat of a stabilization of our economy as opposed to a significant contraction and a continued, down the slide. But he'll make this argument. He'll say you can't cheat the math. Eventually, you have to pay the piper. Eventually, if these debts keep going up, you have to service them. There's no way you can't service your debts in the end. Now, there are a lot of people out there who are arguing, no, at some point you can actually default on your debts if you're the United States, and it may not have the catastrophic, it may not be as catastrophic as some people would argue. But you also have to understand more importantly, how economics, how money works in our system. If the Federal Reserve has all these reserve accounts, and they're all, it's all virtual, it's all digitized, it's all on computers. And so when we are, for example, servicing our debt to China, right, because we offer bonds on the bond market, and China says, sure, we still think that U.S. debt is good, so we will lend you money, and you'll, agree to pay us back more. When they call in their chips, it's not like we're like, oh, where are we going to get the money from? It's all that happens at the Federal Reserve is that we tweak the accounts, right? So essentially China has a savings account and a checking account at the Federal Reserve, and you just move numbers around, and it suffices to satisfy the Chinese in terms of the monies that we owe them, servicing the debts that we are obligated to service, and it allows the economy to keep functioning. But people like Denninger and people on the right and people like, Dan Pierce, who don't understand or are unwilling to admit that in a modern monetary system there is a difference between public and private debt. There is a difference between values, what your values are, and what is actually happening in the economy. And, very importantly, there is a difference between how money is created and who has access to it versus the fact that money is simply being created. A lot of people who are opposed to fiat money, money that can just be created by typing a few computer keystrokes into the computer, a lot of people who are opposed to fiat money make the argument that it is going to crash eventually, and it is going to destroy the world eventually because it's not real. It's false, it's fake. It's just, numbers typed into computers. But what these people, and it tends to be people on the right who may understand something about economics but are unwilling to admit the following. What a lot of people on the right are unwilling to admit is that it's not money creation that we need, and I've said this before, it's not money creation that we need to fear. It is how the system works and who has access to that money. Look, the federal government in 2008, because AIG had all of these, tens of trillions of dollars worth of credit default swap exposure out there in, the marketplace. And the fear was that if AIG collapsed, went the way of Lehman, right? That we could create a verb out of Lehman. Oh yeah, they Lehmanated, right? Oh yeah. That's a Lehmanizing experience, right? If AIG went the route of Lehman Brothers and, basically went down the tubes, that would create another, huge downturn in the economy and panic and selling on the markets, right? Because you get these positive feedback loops where people get panicking and they're like, sell, right? Trading places, sell. Well, how much did the federal government, in concert with the Federal Reserve, how much did the federal government create? How much money did they create to bail out AIG? $500 billion? $500 billion? Right? You like that? Trillion? Yep, still. Right? Concentrating on the road. Very good. I've been driving a car. I'm 50 years old. I've been driving since I was 16 and a half. I've never been in an accident, and I've had one moving violation. I was about 22 years old, and it was a Sunday in Northampton, Massachusetts, and I was on my way to a wedding event, and I crossed the yellow line to pass somebody, and there was nobody else on the road, and I got a ticket for that. That's it. 30 years of driving after that without a ticket. I'm a very safe driver. As a matter of fact, many people who have driven with me are like, Dan, you're going the speed limit. I'm like, yes, I always, you see all these cars that are passing me? Anyway. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, we bail out AIG to the tune of $500 billion. This is a value judgment. This is not about economics, right? The value judgment on the part of Henry Paulson and the Federal Reserve and Tim what's his name, Geithner, blah 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 blah. Ben Bernanke, la 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 la. The value judgment was we need to save AIG because ... and they could give a lot of reasons why. Well, what if instead of saving AIG, what if instead of bailing out we took that $500 trillion in debt monetized by the Federal Reserve and distributed based upon population to the states? What if the states then used that money not only to hire workers to rebuild the infrastructure, but also to, mitigate the mortgage crisis created by years and years and years of malfeasance in the mortgage, the banking, underwriting? These are value judgments. The government made the value judgment that we needed to bail out Wall Street. A lot of people on the political right say those monies should never have been spent. My argument is people in Washington and people on Wall Street made a judgment as to where we were putting our resources. Look, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars each year on our defense budget. That's a value judgment. It's a political and a value-based judgment. Some people on the political right would like to spend more. Some people on the political left would like to spend less. Do we get that money from taxes? Do we need to have taxes that raises the revenue in order to spend that money? No. I mean, we've been spending that money without, regardless of taxation. As a matter of fact, during the Bush years, taxes, there was a tax cut, right? And in order to stimulate spending and stimulate economic growth. And at the same time, we were spending, upwards of $1 trillion fighting two wars, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan. These are value judgments. A lot of people would say, well, in the end, you're going to end up having to pay for that. You're going to end up having to pay, and it's going to cause all kinds of crises, and that's what precipitated the economic downturn, etc. No. That's not what precipitated the economic downturn. What created the economic downturn, and the political right is unwilling to admit this because it is something that if they did admit would make it hard for them to argue for the Romney deregulatory ideal. What created the economic crisis was years of Ponzi economy, years of economic growth based upon the extension of credit that was never had the possibility of private credit, that never had the ability of being repaid, and everybody buying in to try and get on the, to try and get in on the bubbles, get in on the craze when there were no underlying assets, no underlying productive assets to support or to back up those investments. That's what created the crisis, because when the bubbles popped, or the real estate bubble popped, when the internet bubble popped, when all of these, huge Ponzi schemes popped, you end up having contraction. And what ends up happening, of course, is then the Federal Reserve has to jump in and stimulate the economy by pumping trillions of dollars into the economy, and then the value judgment that they make is, where do those monies go? And what they do is they give those monies to corporations and to banks, and they bail out banks, and because their argument is a very Wall Street-centric argument that if we bail those institutions out, that the money will circulate and that we won't have an economic collapse. You have this thing called velocity of money. So if there's money out there and it's being spent, the more it's being spent, the more people are being able to get their hands on it, etc., etc. Economics is an over-determined science and art. It is extremely complex. There are no closed economic systems. The political right would have you believe that if we simply cut down on government spending and we cut down on taxation, that would create extraordinary economic growth. It's a political argument. Most people on the political right just don't like the idea that we are moving in this direction of more government support for people. They don't like that idea. They like the idea of people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, etc. And in the near term, if you had a Romney administration, you probably would have a growth in the equities markets, and you probably would have it would be a stimulus. There would be growth in employment, I believe, but it would be short-lived because it would be based upon deregulation, and we know, because it's an ongoing issue, that banks and other financial institutions would game the system, would create more bubbles. People who bought into the bubbles early and got out early would make their millions, and everybody else would be left holding the bag. Conversely, if you move into a more regulatory environment, you are going to rely more upon the government in order to stimulate economic growth and in order to take care of the 300 plus million people who live in this nation. And that, again, is a value judgment. These things are, to a great extent, independent of economics. They are, to a great extent, independent of economics because we live in economics. We live in this system in which we can, as a nation, create money. We have a fiat currency, an irredeemable currency. We can open the spigots up and create liquidity, or close the spigots. We can raise taxes as a way to try and slow the economy down, or we can decrease taxes as a way to try and increase, to speed the economy up. All done in an effort to try and stabilize the economy. But these efforts on the part of the Federal Reserve and on the part of the government are, to a great extent, not about politics and economics. They're just not about values and politics. They're just about figuring out ways to try and keep things from falling apart. The arguments made by the right and the left are values-based arguments. So, in my opinion, it's very important to understand when you're making an argument about debt, or about public debt, or about private debt, or about our money as debt system, or about the extension of credit, or about mitigating the mortgage crisis, or about unemployment, stimulating employment. Who's going to do it? Is it going to be private? Is it going to be public? It's important to understand that your position is a values, not ethical. It's who you are, what you believe, what you think about life. It's a values-based position. But if you hide behind this idea that you are making an economic argument, it's not true. If you're Dan Pierce on the Dan Pierce Show and you're saying, you know, in the end, the debt's going to get us and it's just about math and all this kind of stuff, it's not true. It's not that simple, and it's not true. Dan Pierce is a conservative man, and he supports and believes in conservative values. Fine, whatever. And his arguments are values-based. That's what he bases his political beliefs upon, and yet then he says, and this is where he goes off the beam. He says, and if we don't follow my values, the economy will tank and the country will fail. That's the lie. That's the untruth. The untruth that is uttered by both sides of the political spectrum, but in this economic climate, particularly on the political right, the untruth that is so detrimental to an honest argument, an honest discussion, an honest political discussion, is that if we don't follow the values of the right, that it's going to destroy the nation economically. And that's not true. That's simply untrue. One has to look at economics and debt and all of the ways in which money works in our system somewhat independently from values. And to say, okay, we have 315 million people in the country, we have 100 million people who live at or below the poverty level, and take a look at all the issues and then say, okay, what are our values? What do we believe? Do we believe we need to take care of these people? Do we believe that we don't need to take care of these people? And then say, okay, how do we use our fiat currency system? How do we use government and money as a way to support or promote our values? If we decide as a nation that our value system is everybody needs to fend for themselves, and if you can't make it work, if you can't, like Dennis Miller says, well, we all start at the same place. He's such a smarmy guy. We all start at the same place, but that's just the starting line, and then wherever you end up, man, like that's just how it is, right? If that's your value system, and if that's what the country decides to have as its values, that we're not going to spend money on taking care of the have-nots, then that's a values-based argument. Don't hide behind it being, well, we can't afford it. We can't afford to have unemployment insurance and spend billions of dollars. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We just have to then make values-based judgments about how we're going to use the money that we create, the money in our system, how we're going to use that money to support our values as a nation. That's the decision that you need to make in the coming election. When people make the argument that about taxes, raising taxes or lowering taxes, and they say we need higher taxes on the rich in order to create money to spend, it's not really true. And taxation is primarily like the federal government levies taxes as a way to legitimize itself, because if everybody said, well, I'm not paying taxes, well, that would be the end of the government, right? Because it would basically be a vote of no confidence in the nation. And again, taxes are used to open or close the spigot on economic growth. Lower taxes, promote spending, and maybe try to speed the economy up. Raise taxes, slow the economy down. But we can spend money, we have been, since the mid-1970s. We can spend money regardless of the tax rate, because the spending of the creation of money by the Federal Reserve through the monetizing of debt and the levying of taxes are to a great extent mutually exclusive. Not totally, but to a great extent mutually exclusive. So when you hear people on the right saying, raising taxes is going to kill the entrepreneurial spirit and is going to slow economic growth, and when you hear people on the left say, if we don't raise taxes, we're not going to be able to spend money on public services and on all those things we need to spend money on, these are values-based judgments. They don't reflect our ability to have economic growth or to take care of the 300 plus million people in the country based upon monetary policy and the federal operations of the central bank, the Federal Reserve, in concert with our Treasury. They are They are arguments that are political and values-based. They are ideological arguments. They are not economic arguments. So you have to decide. You have to decide out there in voter land, what are your values? What do you believe? And then understand that based upon your values, that's what you're going to vote. And then we can, because we are the most powerful economy in the world, and because we are an economy that is sovereign and we can create money as we need to, you are going to then decide based upon your values how you're going to vote, and then followingly, our government and our central bank, etc., are going to create monetary policy or implement monetary policy and implement financial policy, fiscal policy, that reflects those values. Angry Moderate, driving to Dracut, Massachusetts, on my way to teach a soccer coaching course. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can always email me, dan@theangrymoderate.org. And I'll try in my time in Massachusetts not to come back with a really deep Massachusetts accent. Now, granted, I'm going to be there for 36 hours, so you never know. I could come back just talking like this, and the next show of The Angry Moderate will sound like this, but hopefully not. Thank you for listening, and until next time, bye-bye.